We're going to wrap up chapter 6, the penultimate chapter tonight, and we'll finish out the book in the next couple of gatherings. Before we read the passage tonight, I have done my best as we've worked through this book to equip you not just to read the book of Micah, but to understand the prophets as a whole. And we've already talked about a handful of things that make the prophets difficult for us to interpret, understand, and apply today. We've talked about the fact that they're chock full of figurative language. We've talked about the fact that they're extensively historical, and so you have to be up to snuff on your ancient Near East, semi-ancient history. One of the things we haven't talked about, though, tonight would be helpful to discuss before we get started. And that is the fact that the prophets, in particular, the books of the prophets, are recursive. Recursive means to go back to the beginning and to begin again. It means to do over. It doesn't mean to repeat. It's not that the prophets say the same thing over and over again. It's that they cover the same message, the same events. They try and make the same point over and over again. And as they do so, what makes it recursive is that they shift their perspective. They go, well, let's look at it from another angle. Okay? Think of a surround sound stereo. Right? Each speaker in the mix carries some, but not all of the song. That's like recursive. It's like the left speaker and the right speaker and then the center speaker and then the subwoofer, and all together you get the whole message. And so it's worth asking the question, why? Why do the prophets feel the need to be recursive? Over here they go, okay, let's put it in the language of a courtroom. Over here, let's put it in the language of a marriage. Over here, let's put it in the language of a disobedient child. Let's walk around naked for 40 days. Let's build a little fortress and siege it like I'm playing G.I. Joes. Let me tell a parable, Jesus says. Let me say it metaphorically, and they understand it literally. Let me say it literally, and they understand it metaphorically. You see, the reason why the prophets are recursive, and you're not going to like this, is because we are stubborn to the truth. Not stupid. Jesus' audience, including his disciples, are not stupid. They are just not open to the truth. And this is especially clear in the prophets. Think of the calling of Jeremiah and Ezekiel both. In their commission, God says, no one will listen to you. And then they devote their lives to a single message. A message of disobedience and consequence, a message of impending and inescapable judgment. And they go, okay, well, if you won't understand it this way, how about we attempt it this way? Right? If you criticize me here, what if I explain it in this way? You see, recursive as a literary feature is an evidence of God's abundant grace. That he takes hard-hearted people and exhaustively looks for a way to make his point. He sees that we bolted the door locked and goes around looking for a window. This is how God works. And we've seen it already in Micah. There is nothing new in terms of the facts tonight. Nothing new that Micah wants to say, but he says it in yet another different way. And tonight he does it in the concept of wisdom literature. Okay? And wisdom literature, at its heart, doesn't ask, is it right? It asks, does it work? And this is an important and helpful aspect for us to think about when it comes to injustice. Because I think for many of us, we think injustice works, it's just cheating. Injustice achieves all the things that we're after, it just goes about it in a way that is oppressive and therefore sinful. But as Micah steps into wisdom literature tonight, he makes us question, but does it work? Does injustice actually accomplish what you think it does? It's like Andre the Giant in The Princess Bride, right? I don't think that word means what you think it means. I don't think this does what you think it does. And again, think about that in the context of God trying to make a point. It is sufficient for the creator of the universe to say, this is wrong because I said so. I don't know how you feel about that reality, but you are the clay and he is the pot. Right? It is sufficient for God, who is righteous intrinsically, to say this is righteous and this is not. And so here he condescends and goes, but even if it weren't, are you even finding what you're looking for? Will you just stop banging your head against the sin wall and ask, is this really what I wanted? That's the grace of God. He's willing to talk logistically to show that things are not according to his design. And so look with me here in chapter 6, beginning in verse 9. Listen, the Lord is calling to the city, and to fear your name is wisdom. Heed the rod and the one who appointed it. Am I still to forget your ill-gotten treasures, you wicked house, and the short ephah, which is accursed? Shall I quit someone with dishonest scales, with a bag of false weights? Your rich people are violent. Your inhabitants are liars, and their tongues speak deceitfully. Therefore, I have begun to destroy you, to ruin you because of your sins. You will eat, but not be satisfied. Your stomach will still be empty. You will store up, but save nothing, because what you save I will give to the sword. You will plant, but not harvest. You will press olives, but not use the oil. You will crush grapes, but not drink the wine. You have observed the statutes of Omri, and all the practices of Ahab's house. You have followed their traditions. Therefore, I will give you over to ruin, and your people to derision, and you will bear the scorn of nations. Let's pray. Father, as we look at your word tonight, help us to do so through the lens of wisdom, knowing that as we are called to our life, there are many voices and many superstitions and many false counsel, and maybe even impractical ideas that we can choose to build our life on, but they are shifting sand. And we thank you, Lord, that you are so gracious, so merciful, that you say, as you do in chapter 1 of Isaiah, come let us reason together. Let's have a rational conversation here. And I pray, Lord, for us, that you would just scratch out any foolishness in our lives. That we would have epiphanies of idiocy, of places where we're going, why am I even doing this? And as you do so, Lord, I pray that you would lead us in the paths of wisdom, knowing, as Paul tells us, that Jesus Christ is our wisdom. I pray this in your name. Amen. Like I said, the facts are the same. Injustice, false measures. When it says here, your rich people are violent, it doesn't mean that they're breaking out in fights in the street. It means that they're violently stealing other people's property. It's violent, like it says a few chapters ago, that it's as if they eat the flesh of the poor. But this passage is filled with the language of the wisdom literature. And here I'm thinking, of course, of the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. Also, many of the Psalms are classified as wisdom psalms. I'm thinking of the book of James in the New Testament. I'm thinking of many of the sayings of Jesus, which are wisdom sayings. Okay. And what I want you to notice is how intentionally here Micah parallels the most common vocabulary and the most common concerns of wisdom literature to make this point. You can see it in the opening line. Listen, the Lord is calling to the city. You see, most of the book of Proverbs are proverbs, right? These pithy little statements that have kind of a two-half format, and it's just one rapid fire after another. But the first 10 chapters of Proverbs function as an introduction. And a good portion of that talks about wisdom as if it were personified. walking through the streets and calling to all who desire to be wise to come and to learn of her. And in the same way here, the Lord is seen as if he's walking to the city, inviting them to pay attention, just like Lady Wisdom. And then notice verse 9 continues, and to fear your name is wisdom. One of the wisdom songs tells us explicitly, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Right? Without that aspect, all wisdom becomes foolishness. And so that is right here. But also the emphasis on dishonest scales in verse 11. If you go and read through Proverbs, you'll encounter over and over again warnings about false weights and measures. Just again to remind you culturally of what's going on here. When you would pay for something in Israel, you wouldn't pay with money, you'd pay with silver. And the silver wasn't, stamped with prices that were arbitrary, like our pieces of paper. They were weighted. And so you paid with weight. And so a way to rip off your customers was to have separate scales for weighing the product you were selling and the weight of silver you were bringing in. So you would make sure that the weight of silver was skewed less, so you get more silver for the same price, and the weight of wheat was scaled more, so that you would give them less wheat because it would weigh more. And so here, that occurs when it talks about what tongues do in verse 12. The tongue is a major reference, not just in Proverbs, but James. Remember, James spends a lot of time talking about the tongue. If you flip over, well, I flip over in my Bible, even when you look at verse 16, and it says, you observe the statutes of Omri and all the practices of Ahab's house. Literally here it says you walked in the counsels of Omri. Now Omri, and specifically his son or his grandson Ahab, is exhibit A of a bad king. Okay? If you've got David on one side, you've got Ahab on the other. Pretty easy to measure the difference. But by using the language of walking in the counsel of Omri, it instantly makes us think of the first wisdom psalm, which is actually Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. And so by evoking this language, he says, you're learning in the wrong school. You're walking in the counsel of the ungodly, of Exhibit A, the worst line of kings that Israel ever knew. But there's a second aspect to this. Wisdom literature is inherently observational and not revelational. You know what I mean? I mean, it's not God telling Israel what is, it's the writer of the Proverbs looking out around and going, how things work. Okay? In fact, the Proverbs are the closest thing we have to modern science. They're tested hypotheses. They're not always true. They're generally true. And so if you are lazy, poverty is in your future. This is the Proverbs. But how do we know that? Does God say, this is what I'll do to lazy people, I'll make them poor? No. It's just you don't work, you have less to eat. You're lazy, you're hard to keep a job, right? Proverbs are observational in nature. Side note, this is why Christians should be all about not just the hard sciences, but the soft sciences as well. Proverbs, I would suggest to you, leaves extensive room for psychology. As long as you remember the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, recognizing how brains work, recognizing how we think, recognizing how things usually go when we relate to other people, that entire area is proverbial. It's wisdom. It's observational. Okay. And so any wisdom apart from revelation quickly becomes foolishness. We'll get back to that later. But for us, we should never be afraid of observations. Okay. And recognizing that the conclusions we draw from an ordered world are reliable conclusions. Wisdom literature is built on that. But there's another implication of this. A good part of wisdom literature is watching examples and learning from them so you don't have to learn the lesson the way they did. Right? The fool says, I know this happened to them, but I'll be fine, and has the same consequence. And so by evoking Omri and Ahab here, what we're really talking about is the northern tribes again. Remember how we've talked about how this book is built right after the destruction of the northern tribes, even with Assyria at the very gates of Jerusalem, and then by miraculous hand God saves them, but he's warning that that's not the end. Babylon will eventually come and finish what Assyria started, right? That's the context of the book. And so here he says, you're walking in the path of Omri. You're listening to the counsel of Ahab. And the question is, how'd that go for Omri? How'd that work out for Ahab? And again, this is not unique to Micah. Ezekiel draws this same conclusion. Turn over to Ezekiel 23. Just for context, look at verse 1 of 23. The word of the Lord came to me, son of man, there were two women, daughters of the same mother. Okay. One is Oholah, and one is Oholibah. But really, we're just talking about the northern tribes and the southern tribes. Okay. And so he's drawing out this story. They're both redeemed from Egypt. They're both brought into faithfulness. They're both saved from these things. And then the older sister decides to make some bad life choices. And so, if you look here at 23 in verse 7, this is talking about the older sister, Oholah. She gave herself as a prostitute to all the elite of the Assyrians and defiled herself with all the idols of everyone she lusted after. She did not give up prostitution. She began in Egypt, when during her youth men slept with her, caressed her virgin bosom, and poured out their lust on her. Therefore, I delivered her into the hands of her lovers, the Assyrians for whom she lusted. They stripped her naked, took away her sons and daughters, and killed with the sword. She became a byword among women, and a punishment was inflicted on her. Her sister, verse 11, Oholibah, saw this, yet in her lust and prostitution, she was more depraved than her sister. She too lusted after the Assyrians, governors and commanders, warriors in full dress, mounted horsemen, all handsome young men. I saw that she too defiled herself. Both of them went the same way. Now Ezekiel goes on to basically say, isn't Oholibah even more guilty? Not because she did worse sins, but because she did the same sins despite having the example. Right? She saw the consequences and still made the same choices. That's a wisdom perspective. And so getting back to Micah, over and over and over again, he evokes the framework, the perspective, the language of wisdom literature. And so it's clear here that what he's trying to get us to ask the question of, again, is how do we think about injustice through the lens of wisdom? And he unpacks it for us, starting there in verse 13. Therefore I have begun to destroy you. Notice the tense there. Therefore, not I will destroy you, future tense. Therefore I've already begun. Okay. He says this has already happened. Now, this isn't because God has moved into divine judgment. It's because they're already experiencing natural consequence. I'll show you. Look at verse 14. You will eat and not be satisfied. Your stomach will still be empty. Now, notice here, unlike the rest of this passage, because the more you read, if you keep going, it's pretty clear he's going to say, eventually I'm going to interrupt the harvest cycle, and you're going to sow, but you won't reap because it won't be your land anymore. Right? He's going to say, you're going to prepare wine, and you're going to store it up, but it'll never get to vintage because it's going to get sacked. Okay, so this rolls right into judgment. But consider this first one. The issue is not you will have nothing to eat. He doesn't prophesy a famine. He says you'll eat plenty. but it won't satisfy you. So remember, the audience here is primarily the wealthy and the powerful. That's who Micah is most concerned about here. And so effectively he's saying, you've got your filet mignon. You're eating your lobster thermidor, but you're not happy. Right? That's the issue here. It's not if they're full, if their stomachs are full, it's if they're satisfied. And again, that's a wisdom language concern. I would suggest to you, as we look at this passage, we see inklings of three different levels of wisdom. And the first one is the one we've talked about primarily tonight. It is what we could call observational wisdom. It's surface wisdom. It's cause and effect wisdom. Okay? I'll give you an example. Okay? We recognize that God, in his revealed law, condemns dishonesty and lying. Consistent. Makes the Ten Commandments, makes most of the vice list. It's normally stated lying is wrong. But we have, and I would suggest to you rightly, started to talk about honesty in modern America using the phrase, honesty is the best policy. And what we're trying to imply is not just that honesty is right, but that honesty is productive. That in the long run, developing a reputation as someone who doesn't keep their promises, or someone who can't be trusted, or someone who always does a double deal, is bad for business. Okay? Honesty is the best policy recognizes that your reputation is a part of what leads you to success, even in the business world. And so honesty in the best policy goes beyond saying lying is wrong to say that lying is foolish in the long run. In the same way, the Proverbs is full of ways to succeed. And there's a problem with injustice. And again, it's not that it leads to success in the wrong way. Micah would ask, does it lead to success? And here's the problem. All the way back in Genesis, it says it's not good that man should be alone. All the way back in Genesis, it recognizes that isolation is a problem. All the way back in Genesis, there's an emphasis on the fact that you were designed for community. You were built for it. You need it. You know this because when you were born, you were not born self-sufficient or independent. For a child to die, all that needs to be done is nothing. And you, as the child, can do whatever you want, but if nothing is done for you, you're done. Even when we think of great success stories, like Robinson Crusoe, recognize that all of those survival skills come from the investment of community. He didn't invent knots, or the raft, or fire. Those were all already known, learned things from community. Okay. And so, in a sense, independence is a farce. It's just not a real thing. But even when you achieve it, even if you could learn how to live on your own, and you could go out into the woods, and you could separate yourself from people for the rest of your lives, it doesn't go well. Right? Have you guys ever watched the show Alone? Eventually, psychologically, things begin to fall apart. Okay. So you're made for community. But the problem is, most of the sins against people that the Bible condemns are naturally, obviously, antisocial. They do not make friends. They do not hold families together. They do not cultivate stronger bonds. In fact, the foolishness of injustice thinks this is what I have to do to get ahead. And it can make you money, but it can't make you life. Because the real things that we need, not just for happiness, but for well-being and wholeness, involve other human beings. You see, if you are, the evil landlord who benefits from redlining and the development of ghettos and the projects and these types of things, you cultivate a community of scarcity which leads to violence and destruction in your town. And maybe you can climb up on the mountain and you can avoid that to a significant degree, but it severs, it destroys, it deconstructs community. In the same way, you cannot build a successful marriage on a lie. Eventually, you begin to put strain on the relationship, either because they find out or because you are pretending to be someone you're not, and you're not even in the marriage anymore. Just this facsimile. Either way, suddenly the marriage doesn't do for you what you need it to do. This is the way that sin works. Sin, again, I said, is obviously antisocial. And so the problem with injustice is that it can fill your belly but not satisfy you. And the truth is, you guys know this. Some of you have seen Citizen Kane, right? The most powerful, most influential, most wealthy man, and the only thing that matters in his life is his childhood sled. Spoiler alert. He never finds anything better than that. Why? Because the way he goes about it, he forgets what's truly important. Even our culture knows how to tell these stories regularly, but, again, we are stubborn to the truth. So even when we tell tales that are cautionary, they become heroes of the next generation. I mean, this has happened so many times, but I'll just illustrate it once. In the movie Wolf of Wall Street, it tells the real story, like Great Gatsby come to life, of the pursuit of wealth and how it destroys a man's life. And the filmmakers will tell you they were making a cautionary tale. But the natural and consistent response of the audience was, that's the life I want. Right? That issue is foolishness. It's foolishness. And what he's saying here is playing the short game isn't a shortcut. It doesn't get you where you think it gets you. It doesn't lead not just to righteousness, but to flourishing. You might get wealthy, but you won't get healthy. It's not the way it works. You were built to flourish together. Sin moves in the wrong direction, so it never gets there. It can't get to flourishing. So that's the base level here. Like I said, observational wisdom. But there's also what I think we could press upon it, which is disciplinary wisdom. Okay. Part of the instruction here, even in verse 1, heed the rod and the one who appointed him. That's a reference to discipline. The metaphor here is the father-son relationship. And Proverbs is full of this, like it or not, right? Spare the rod, spoil the child. Right? Do not despise discipline in your youth. The wise man receives correction over and over and over again. But discipline is different than natural consequence, right? Natural consequence is you touch something hot and you get burned. Discipline is you touch something that doesn't belong to you and you get spanked. You see the difference? Discipline is personal. It's parental. It doesn't happen out in nature, but happens relationally. And one of the things we need to recognize here is that Israel had forgotten to take God into equation. More on that. But they had also forgotten that they were God's people. In fact, some of the other prophets make jokes about Israel as if they forget that God is all-knowing. And they think, he can't possibly know I cooked the books. I put that in a locked drawer. Right? It doesn't work. And actually, this is something, by the way, that kids do all the time. Little kids don't understand the disparity between themselves and adults. So they think that they can hide things that they cannot hide. In fact, sometimes, right, have you ever seen this when a 2-year-old's like, all right, I'm going to get in trouble, so now they can't find me. Right? And effectively, that's Israel's problem. They think just because they can hide this from the IRS, they can hide this from God, and they can't. And again, remember that discipline is relational. This is not about ultimate and final judgment. This is about in-life correction. It has to do with the fact that they are God's people. Have you ever noticed not just that the church is a mess, but it's publicly one? How often do people in the name of Christ get caught with their hand in the cookie jar? And almost in an understandable way, our world looks at that and goes, wait, aren't these supposed to be the good guys? Aren't they the self-proclaimed ones that have devoted themselves to doing the right thing? Why is there so much sexual abuse? Why is there so much financial scandal? Why is there so much power hungry? But I don't actually think those things exist more in the church than they do in the world. I just think the church gets caught more because God cares about what happens in his name. He cares about the victims of those things, and he also cares about the perpetrators. He cares about his children. You remember what Hebrews tells us about discipline? First, it says, discipline is never fun when it's happening. Right? That's kind of the point. Discipline is never Disneyland. And second, it says, but discipline is also evidence that you are the children of God. Because you don't spank a stranger's kids. It's just not done. Right? Not only is it inappropriate, it'd be ineffective. The whole idea is built on relationship. What I'm suggesting to you here is Israel has forgotten that they are God's children and called to represent him. And when they live out of alignment with that mission, there's going to be consequences. Not just gravity consequences, but divine will consequences. And that's another way that the discipline works. And so you should recognize in your life, again, you can hide things from the IRS. You can hide things from other members in your church, but you cannot hide things from God, your Father, who loves you. And if you feel like you can, you should be much more worried. Because that's the other side of the coin in Hebrews, right? If you get away with it over and over, forever and ever, amen, Hebrews says you're not a real son. You don't really have a relationship with the Father. And again, that's not because God doesn't care about you. It's because you haven't entered into that relationship. It's available to you. And so the second issue here that Micah wants us to see about injustice is the people who are called to be the representation of justice on earth can't get away with it. And God is tremendously patient. But when he says here, I have already begun to destroy you, its natural consequence is moving into discipline, and pretty soon it will into destruction. So there's observational wisdom, there's fatherly or disciplinary wisdom, but there's also deeper wisdom. You see, when you read the Bible as a whole, it makes a contrast between different types of wisdom. It recognizes that underlying and beneath the wisdom of Proverbs is another wisdom that needs to be considered. Have you ever noticed that Proverbs sometimes makes observational points about things that are morally wrong? It says, for example, the gifts of a man will open ways for him. That's not talking about talents, guys. That's talking about bribes. It recognizes that bribes work. It also says having a lot of money is a way to have a lot of friends. Right? I didn't have 150 people dressed to the gills come to my birthday party. Kanye probably did. Okay. And so observations of the way things work are not always moral. But more than that, they're also, again, short-sighted. They're short-sighted because they're what James calls worldly wisdom. They're worldly wisdom that forgot the foundation of wisdom, which is the fear of the Lord. They're worldly wisdom that thinks about the impact and the consequences of life up to the funeral, but never past it. And so look at what James says in James chapter 2. Chapter 3, actually. In verse 13, He says, who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in humility that come from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom, my Bible has air quotes there, does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere, peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. Now notice two things here. First off, James suggests that there's a way to engage in wisdom that requires more than just obeying the cause and effect. It requires the orientation of your heart. It gets us at motive. Now I think this is really important because as we read the book of Micah, many of you have never had the opportunity to ride a judge. Many of you don't have the power and influence to steal someone's life. And so there's a tendency to think injustice is irrelevant to me. But the wisdom language helps us to make it relevant with the help of James. Because where does he say that worldly wisdom exists? Verse 14, if you harbor envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, such wisdom does not come down from heaven. Okay. How do you know if you have accepted and embraced worldly wisdom? Jealousy and selfish ambition. That's a lot more relevant. The recognition here is that you can take the book of Proverbs and use it as a book of how to win friends and influence people, and do it in a way that is prideful and arrogant. Do it in a way that is seeking your own end, and you're just trying to do it because honesty is the best policy, so I'm going to make the most money this way. Envy is an even more interesting one. Jesus warns us in the Sermon on the Mount about worshiping God and mammon, and the impossibility to worship two masters. Before he says you cannot serve God and mammon, he focuses on the rich. But after, he focuses on the poor. The poor can serve mammon. The poor can worship mammon. Slavery can either be one of joy or one of fear. Idolatry can either be one of chasing after, or it can be one of running from. Why? Envy and selfish ambition live on both sides of that spectrum. You know, Jesus only tells one parable that calls a man a fool. And it's a deeper wisdom parable. In the book of Luke, he talks about a man who has an amazing economic year. He's got more than he can sell in the year, more than he can eat in his family, and so he goes, wow, what am I going to do with all these resources? And he thinks, I know. I'm going to build new barns, and I will fill them with all this crop, and then basically I can retire because I'll have more than I need and enough to sell the rest of my life. And Jesus says, immediately God spoke to him and said, you fool, did you not know that this very night your soul would be required of you? And the implication here is not just that he would never get a chance to eat or to sell all that grain, he won't even build the barns. But he concludes in this way. He says, therefore, make sure that you are wealthy unto the Lord. Jonathan Edwards called the poor God's receivers. This is what he points out. It's really hard to give God anything because he already has it. So God has appointed the poor to be his receivers. The ones that you give to who have needs, and God, as it says in Deuteronomy, pays those debts himself. If you want to give to the poor, or give to God, you give to the poor. Side note, Jesus says the same thing right? When he separates into the sheep and the goats, what does he say? You visited me in prison. You fed me when I was hungry. You gave me a drink when I was thirsty. You clothed me when I was naked. He says, when did we ever see you? As much as you did to the least of your brothers, you did it to me. That's the deeper wisdom. The danger that that man was in was that he was so caught up in his own ambition, he forgot that he was mortal. And that he would one day stand before God, and he wouldn't be just asking, how did you increase your economics, and how did you lead to a bumper crop? And then say, congratulations, you're a good farmer, welcome into heaven. He'd say, what did you do with the resources I gave you? How did you give? How did you share? How did you build? How did you cultivate that flourishing? Right? So, consequence in this life, discipline in this life, but ultimately, all will stand before the living God and give an account. And when we forget that, fool is the only option. When it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, or let's put it this way, the fool says in his heart, what? There is no God. That's not atheism. You guys recognize that, right? The idea there isn't somebody who's saying, God doesn't exist. The idea is the fool says in his heart, I don't have to make any account for God. The fool says in his heart, I can do what I want. The fool doesn't take God into account. There is a potential for practical atheism, even in a professional theism. It's about the way you live, not your theology. Remember, this is Proverbs. It's about the way you live, not your theology. And the problem with the man that Jesus critiques, and the warning that James gives us here, is to stop living, to use the Reformers' language, in coram deo, before the face of God. And Israel is wrong on all three counts. Injustice doesn't work. You never get away with injustice if you're the child of God. And in the long run, where I'm in the final weighing of the scales, injustice is never worth it. Two things. One is, even when we are the recipients of evil, Micah here encourages us to have pity on the wicked. Because they're pretending. Because they're living out, even if they're living on repeat and they haven't stopped long enough to realize it's not working, they're living out a foolish life. I don't really have time for this, but it's one of my favorite stories. So in Les Mis, not in the movie, not in the play, but in the book, Jean Valjean, incredibly reformed, transformed by the generosity of a single man, devotes his life to generosity and giving. But he's also quite a thug. I mean, he's a beefy guy, not the type of guy that you would want to get in a brawl with. And one night he's walking through London and he realizes he's being followed. It can't be London, it's got to be Paris. He realizes he's being followed, and he's being followed by a pickpocket. And the pickpocket has picked the wrong mark, so he jumps on Jean Valjean and instantly he's pinned to the ground. And Jean Valjean says, you have chosen this path because you think that it is easy, but it is hard. And he says, if you want my money, you can have it. And he throws it on his chest. And he says, but for your own sake, flee this foolishness. Love it. But it gets at the heart of what we're talking about here. There is a means here for compassion on the wicked. Not because they are innocent, not even really because they are ignorant, but because they are foolish. But second, it gives us a means to try and make a case in the public square against injustice that makes sense and resonates with those who do not believe the words of the Bible or follow Jesus as Lord. It's an opportunity to go, I'm against this, not just because it's wrong, but because it's bad for our city, because it's harming our families, because it's impacting the children of our nation, or whatever it is. When Christians present studies that show the impacts that bad policy have on people, they're engaging the game that Micah is engaging here. When they make calls to the rich and the famous and the powerful and even the wicked and go, yeah, but are you even happy? Is this really the life you're after? We walk in the shoes of Micah. Wisdom literature compels us to help people live their lives in light of consequence, discipline, and eternal judgment. Because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Let's pray. God, I feel convicted right now to lift up any of my brothers and sisters who have decided that some sinful portion of their life is worth it. And so they're quietly and consistently pursuing a path against your will. I pray tonight, Lord, that you would reveal not just that it will not work, but that it is not working. That the reason that they're so devoted to this habit or justifying of this characteristic or trait is because they're still hoping it will do what it has not done. They're still hoping it will bring what it cannot bring. And I just want to confess on our behalves, Lord, we are, even if we are your children, we are foolish children. We envy the wicked. We find the same selfish ambition in our hearts. We just are afraid of getting caught. And so I pray, Lord, that you would cultivate us into a people who meditate upon and reflect the wisdom from above. That is peaceful and gentle and humble, knowing that those who operate, who function as peacemakers, will bear the fruit of righteousness, cause and effect. Let us sow seeds of wisdom for our sake, for the sake of your church, and for the sake of our world. We pray this all again in the name of Jesus Christ, who is our wisdom, who was the very wisdom from above, who reflected all these things, and we have to admit, his life